If you're able to optimize how quickly the swelling goes down, how quickly you get through that inflamed stage, how quickly you can encourage normal motion, you may not feel like you need to do as many strength exercises, as many balance exercises, or as many muscle stretches because you didn't lose that capacity as much as you may have if you weren't doing those ideas. So, g'day, welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to show you how you can optimize your recovery from an acutely or recently sprained ankle. Now this video is for anyone who has obviously recently sprained their ankle or someone who consistently sprains their ankle over time. And the tips that I want to go through in this video will hopefully help you get through that injured, painful, acutely sore stage as quickly as possible to the next stage of being able to start to load your ankle and start to do some strength and recovery exercises that then transition you back into the sport or activity that you like to do. And what's also important to mention about this video is that we're going to assume that you've been cleared of any of the more sinister issues that can come from a rolled ankle, mainly an ankle fracture. So the first point that is absolutely crucial to understand if you're trying to optimize your recovery from an acute rolled ankle or ankle sprain is that we actually need to avoid the R.I.C.E protocol. Now, this will sound silly to a lot of people considering that rest, ice, compression and elevation has been a genuine staple of modern medical and first aid care for the best part of 40 to 50 years. But what we're slowly understanding about this process is that when we line up what we're trying to do with the R.I.C.E protocol in terms of decreasing pain, decreasing swelling and decreasing inflammation, when we overlap that on top of what the body needs to actually achieve in order to heal effectively, which is experience pain, undergo some inflammation, and have swelling as a consequence. When we put those two things on top of each other, there's a strong disconnect between what we're trying to do and what the body actually should be doing in order to optimize our healing. And effectively, if we put an ice pack on an acutely rolled ankle, instead of facilitating less inflammation and less swelling and less pain, we may actually be slowing down that healing process, which is a staggering thing to consider despite what we've been doing for the last 40 or 50 years. We know that pain is there to help give us boundaries as to what you can or can't do. It's there to tell you exactly how much pressure, how much load, how much use, if any at all, your body is happy to sustain at any one point in your recovery. Swelling is obviously neither a good nor a bad thing that the body has. It's just an accumulation of waste at the end of that inflammatory cycle. So if we're trying to stop swelling or limit swelling, we're sort of focusing on the wrong thing. And instead of trying to limit swelling, we should actually be trying to work on techniques, which we'll get to in the rest of this video, that optimize the removal of swelling to not necessarily pause the healing process, but help your body get through that as quickly as possible. And in terms of inflammation, we know physiologically quite well that we need to experience that inflammatory stage in order to progress to the healing stages of our recovery from something like an ankle sprain. So if we're working on things like using ice, for example, to limit inflammation, we may essentially be limiting that inflammation, but by doing that, we're also limiting the ability for our body to transition through to that healing phase. So instead of trying to stop inflammation, we need to try and, again, consider ways to improve our body's ability to progress quickly through that inflamed stage in order to get to that healing stage as quickly as possible. So to break this down a little bit further, we're looking at the components of R.I.C.E in terms of rest, ice, compression, and elevation. When we're looking at rest, the idea that rest can help speed up the healing process is a little bit misguided when you think about it, because the body itself is wired for movement, but more specifically when we're talking about swelling, the only way or the most optimal way that your body can remove swelling is via that passive muscle pump that happens through movement. So if you have sprained your ankle and you put your foot up and you don't use it, then clearly we're not facilitating the removal of that swelling as much as possible. We're also not using your tissues and loading your tissues, so the quality of the healing that you'll be experiencing may not be as good as the quality of healing that you could be experiencing by generally putting some pain-free, respectful loading through that tissue. In terms of ice, the idea that we've just spoken about, where we use ice for pain relief, we use ice to decrease inflammation and decrease swelling, despite all of those three things not only being natural, but crucial to that healing process. And what we tend to find is it's very similar to putting a pause on the healing process as opposed to speeding it up, which can surprise a lot of people. Now, in terms of compression, the interesting thing about this idea is, in theory, we compress the tissue to limit the amount of swelling that gets and accumulates in the area. But not only does that subtle tourniquet limit potentially the amount of swelling and fluid into the area, But by nature, it will also limit the ability for that swelling to come out of the area as optimally as possible. So when we're using compression and compression devices for the sole purpose of reducing swelling, it may actually be counterproductive that in terms of once the swelling that is in there may not also be able to get out as effectively as we want it to. And then we can take the same approach with elevation, where the idea of elevation is that we'll put our foot above the level of our heart to try and flush out a lot of the fluid that might accumulate in that ankle, in the view that that fluid is limiting the ability for that ankle to heal and to process through that, progress through that healing phase as optimally and as quickly as possible. But by having your foot elevated and decreasing the ability of fluid to get there, that fluid also carries a lot of the healing factors and the chemicals that your body needs to express optimal healing. So we may have an impact on the available fluid in the area, but it may also be counterproductive because that fluid and a lot of the blood flow that goes there is having a harder time getting to the area that it potentially could if we didn't do that. So it's a really important point to understand that the rest, ice, compression and elevation protocols that we've expressed for so long have the best intentions and they make sense on the surface in terms of what we're trying to do. But when we take a step back and consider what the body actually needs to happen to heal, there's a little bit of a disconnect, as I said, between those two things. So the second thing that I think is really important to discuss when trying to optimize your recovery from an acute ankle sprain revolves around this concept of movement and use. Now, we spoke about this a second ago in terms of why rest alone shouldn't be at the top of your priority list in terms of optimizing your healing, because we know that the majority of your body's processes are wired to function best through movement and use and loading. We know that bones and ligaments and tissue heal better when there is some respectful loading of the area throughout the process of healing. And we know that muscles tend to get a little bit weaker, swelling tends to be promoted more so when we do rest and don't use and explore what our comfortable window of use may be during an ankle sprain or any injury for that matter. So what I normally promote to people is we really want to find whatever your comfortable window of movement and use may be at any given time throughout your rehab. And obviously, as you progress and get better, that window will get bigger and bigger and bigger. But one of the main reasons why we need to respect pain so much and why something like ice and pain medications may be counterproductive is that it really disallows you to get a sense of where your boundaries may be. And if you have some pain relief or the tissue in the area is numb from ice, it can be very easy to overstep the amount of use that your tissue is ready for, which can then feed back into more inflammation, more swelling, more pain potentially down the track. So whether it is gently walking around, or if you can't weight bear just yet, just getting your foot and ankle out and moving it in a way that you feel is very respectful to the boundaries that your body is setting for you. We need to make sure that you're exploring that as best as you feel comfortable. Now, for people that can't quite walk normally without a limp, then obviously the type of shoes that you wear, whether you want to go for some crutches or a single crutch or an elbow crutch versus an underarm crutch, it's completely dependent on how you feel and what you feel you need to go through in order to move normally without limping. Or you can go for something like a moon boot for the short term, just to really change the amount of force that's going through your ankle to allow you to load that up respectfully without overdoing it. You want to make sure that if you do try and walk, you try and walk as normally as possible, even if your steps are shorter or that your speed is slower, just to make sure that you can tolerate the amount of loading that you're doing. If you can't, make sure you use a crutch. If it's one crutch, make sure it's on the opposite side. Use a boot if you feel you need to. Even strapping it up or taping it can also help to facilitate that a little bit more. But the key thing to remember from this point is that we need to use your tissue, use your body, load your tissues as best as you feel comfortable in a very respectful, responsible way, and that will increase as your recovery progresses as well. So the third thing that we can talk about to help optimize your recovery from an acute ankle sprain revolves around ways to optimize the removal of swelling and fluid as quickly as possible. But sometimes it's impractical to be walking around on your feet 24/7 to optimize that process, whether it be because it hurts too much or you've got other stuff to do. So the other ways that we can sort of facilitate this revolve around simple ideas like soft tissue massage. Now, this can be really important because not only can soft tissue massage be a very good way to flush out some of that fluid, but it can be also a great way to desensitize the painful area. Now, what I would get most people to do, and you can do this yourself, now you can put your foot up on something, obviously to elevate that to help expedite the removal of that waste. But as we said before, you don't want to make a habit of having it up here for too long when you're not doing this, just because it will help remove some of that fluid, but it may also impede the good fluid or the fluid carrying the good nutrients from getting back to the area, and again, counterproductive in terms of optimizing that recovery. But for the purposes of this, we want to do a superficial, gentle, respectful massage where we're ultimately trying to milk away the fluid from the area. So starting distally or starting at the furthest point away on your foot, working our way towards the ankle, and then gently working our way over the top of the ankle, and then up towards the calf and towards the back of the knee. By doing this, we're respectfully trying to mechanically remove some of that swelling, but as I said, the constant touch, the constant stimulation in a respectful way can really help desensitize how sore it actually feels in this area. Now, it's really important to remember that we're not talking about a massage in terms of like a soft tissue massage or a deep tissue massage where we're trying to get in there and break up the tissue. We're not necessarily trying to disrupt any of the healing that's happening over the top of where those ligaments are. What we're trying to do is just really just milk it and a gentle superficial pressure to really try and get that tissue to free up. And then what you hopefully feel straight away is that when you get up and walk around straight away, it should feel a little bit better to do so, a little bit painful than it would have otherwise. Now, following on from this idea, we can also talk about two really helpful devices that you may or may not have heard of before, and they are the Normatec and the Mark Pro devices. Now, I don't have them with me to demonstrate, but I'll leave a link in the description down below so you can check them out just to see what they're all about. But these two devices are fantastic in trying to replicate the idea that we're going for with pain-free, respectful movement and something like massage, where we're trying to tap into that body's lymphatic system to allow this tissue to be pumped out of the area. And what something like the Normatec tends to do is if you put your foot into the Normatec, it's like a big fancy sleeve that pumps up with air. And there's certain compartments that will deflate and inflate to try and mimic this sort of slow sort of pumping mechanism to flush that sort of fluid away from the ankle up towards the knee, up towards your lymph nodes that can then be sort of transferred out of your body. But it's such a fantastic idea because you can have this on while you're doing something else. So if you're at work or you're lying in bed overnight potentially, you can have this device on so it's consistently pumping behind the scenes, allowing that tissue to decongest, that swelling to be removed so that you can start to regain that normal function a lot faster. Because the problem with swelling that tends to accumulate is it tends to shut down the function of the area, which is the point of it. When the tissues around the area experience pain and swelling, it's a clear signal to the area that there is damage and that things need to shut down so that we don't increase the amount of damage in the area. So by allowing that tissue to decongest a lot faster, we're really limiting the amount of muscle atrophy that can occur and a lot of the sensitization that can occur, so that as soon as you feel like you can start to load that tissue again, we can make faster gains to transition you back to strength exercises and pain-free activities and movements. So similar with the Mark Pro, it's a little bit different in a sense where you can place electrodes on the main muscle groups. The Mark Pro has developed this sort of technology where, similar to a TENS machine, but without the discomfort associated with it, you can put some electrodes on and it will just activate those muscles, again, tapping into that muscle pump that you should be getting when you're moving around walking anyway. And those two devices are fantastic because, as I said, it's a passive way to get an active recovery. And for people who are post-op or people that are really trying to get back on their feet for a game really, really quickly, this is a huge step in the right direction that we haven't really explored enough to this point. But athletes are now, or just everyday people, are now experiencing much greater benefits because we're not trying to stop the body from doing something that it's trying to do with things like ice and rest and compression. We're actually trying to encourage the body to do what it's supposed to be doing, but at a much faster rate, which is why we want to try and include this in our strategies to optimize the efficiency of your ability to heal from an ankle sprain or an ankle roll. So the next technique I want to explore to help you optimize your recovery from an acute ankle sprain involves using something called VOODOO floss. Now let me know in the comments down below whether you've heard of VOODOO floss before, Because if you have, I think you'll agree with me in that this is potentially one of the best things that I've seen in a long time to help people recover from acute injury. The reason being is that following on from the principles that we've been trying to promote in terms of optimizing your body's ability to remove that swelling through movement and use, VOODOO floss is a really clever way to respectfully force that to happen a little bit faster. Now, this is a little bit more brutal potentially than something like a Mark Pro or a Normatec or massage or even just walking around, but the results generally tend to speak for themselves. Now, this is the official VOODOO floss that you can buy online. I'll leave a link in the description below if you want to check those out as well. Now, what the technique basically is, it involves wrapping up your foot like you would if you were compressing an injured ankle in the olden days. And again, much like putting your foot up onto something that elevates to optimize the ability to improve that decongestion through massage, this may also sound strange that we're talking about compressing something even though we've just badmouthed compression previously, but it's the short-term nature of the compression that's really important here. Because what we're doing with this sort of stronger rubber band is that we're wrapping it up sort of a half width over the top each time. And we want to make sure that we get as much of the air as we can. We don't necessarily want to leave too many gaps for that swelling to fall into, but we want to really try and have this strong compression around the ankle to really help facilitate the removal of that swelling. Now again, in terms of how tight is too tight, if you genuinely feel like your toes go a little bit tingly or a little bit numb, clearly common sense suggests that this is too tight. You shouldn't feel like your toes go white. If you squeeze your toe, you should feel like there is some blood flow that gets back to there. But the idea of this VOODOO floss technique is that we're only doing this for about a minute or two, but we're going to incorporate movement into this to help shear free some of the restrictions in the area, to decongest the area a little bit faster, and we take it off after a couple of minutes and then reap the benefits of that as well. Now, the idea with this is, as I said, you want to wrap it up the entire ankle as best as you can, and we want to start to use movement to try and shear free and sort of pump out this accumulated congestion. So what we can get you to do, depending on how well you feel you can weight bear, you can literally just sit down and wiggle your foot around if you want to, in whatever direction, whatever movement window you feel available to you. You might find that going from side to side may hurt, obviously, but gently bending that ankle backwards and forwards may be enough to allow this to happen. The other thing that you can do is you are welcome to stand up if you feel comfortable. You can gently bend and flex that if you can, but also what you can do is you can gently walk around in whatever capacity you feel comfortable. But we want to try and find a way to move the ankle through range in all directions to allow this to make a big difference to how you feel. And then the great thing about this is you don't have to take my word for this. As soon as you unwrap it again after 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, whatever you feel very comfortable doing, maybe don't go above 2 minutes just because of the compression. What we should find is it might look a little bit white to begin with, but then as the blood flow returns, you should actually feel like it's a little less congested than what was before. There might be a little bit less pain and your ability to move around improves as well. So with those tips, it's always really important to understand that this is a bit of a continuum in a lot of ways. So ideally, we want to take you through that injured, acutely painful stage through to the painless, more active stage as soon as possible. But it's not necessarily segments where you get to one segment, then you tick over to the next segment and the next segment after that. Generally, it's a continuum of sorts where you're really just trying to listen to your body and work within what you feel comfortable doing and doing it as much as you feel comfortable doing without overstepping the mark and potentially putting a subtle handbrake on top of that. Now, in terms of strength exercises and stretches and things like that, we'll save that for another video because the idea with this is those strength exercises will begin once the pain feels like it's more manageable. Again, whatever your pain-free window will be, you can certainly start isometrics and potentially some subtle balance exercises and stuff like that at some point, depending on how you feel. But there's a little bit of an art form to that that really uses how you feel and the experience of someone like a physio to really match that up to give you the best results possible. In terms of stretches and things like that, obviously they become more important once the pain goes away. But the really interesting thing about this is if you're able to optimize how quickly the swelling goes down, how quickly you get through that inflamed stage, how quickly you can encourage normal motion, You may not feel like you need to do as many strength exercises, as many balance exercises, or as many muscle stretches because you didn't lose that capacity as much as you may have if you weren't doing those ideas. So let me know in the comments down below how those ideas resonated with you. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like rating down below. Subscribe to the channel if you're new. If you found this groundbreaking, if you found it genuinely helpful in terms of optimizing your recovery from an acute ankle sprain, please consider leaving a super thanks donation down below. It's just a great way to help support the channel. But with that being said, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.